just briefly describe who he was for those who don't know?
Sure. Well, Orry-Kelly is an Australian who's born in Kiama. He won an Oscar for costume 3 times for Some Like It Hot, American in Paris, and Les Girls. And he also designed another something like 200 films, and amongst those were some of the great cinema classics like Casablanca, 42nd Street, Maltese Falcon, Auntie Mame, Irma la Douce. And no one in Australia knows who he is.
Very famous at the time. Mm-hmm. In fact, ads for films that he had worked on bore his name in ads in Australia. Very quickly forgotten, though. Why?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my theory was that golden age of Hollywood, which was the time that he was the head of costume at Warner's from 1930s to the 40s, and then, of course, he did some extraordinary work in the 50s and 60s, but there was suddenly, at the end of the 60s, independent American cinema, the new wave in France, Italian cinema, and everything that was the old Hollywood was suddenly out. It was passé. It was considered tacky and gross. And, I mean, I know that people just felt... I mean, I think they even remember Bette Davis as Baby Jane, not as the most extraordinary, wonderful young woman that she was. So his era was just gone, and America was making the films that, I saw as a young film student, Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider. It was grungy and edgy and so on. So this whole thing about design and glamour was gone and out.
Gillian Armstrong, to what extent did you make this film out of guilt?
Well, I think I did make it hugely out of guilt because I felt so terrible that I had never heard of him. And yet I'd seen all those films. And to think that an Australian designed, Ingrid Bergman's clothes in Casablanca, which I've seen many times, and that an Australian designed Some Like It Hot, and yet we knew nothing about him. So it's guilt and I suppose sort of corny nationalism, because once we contacted the American costume historians, they all knew Orry-Kelly, but they didn't necessarily know that he was Australian. And I felt that was really important. I mean, maybe that's pathetic. Maybe it's, sort of flag waving, but I felt Australians, if nothing else, should know of this incredible talent.
I'm just sensing a little remnant there, a bit of residual trace elements of the cultural cringe there with what you just said about pride in the fact that he's Australian. Why not fly the flag, Gillian Armstrong? Why not be boisterously, robustly proud that this guy was an Aussie?
Well, you're right. We don't do that. We don't. And we should, especially about our artists. We do it about our sports people. And yet here's Orry, who's considered one of the most amazing costume designers in the world. And those films that he's made that have stood the test of time, they've influenced so many other people, other costume designers, actors, up and coming. And to think that was made by a boy from Kiama, got on a ship in Sydney Harbour when he was only 24, is extraordinary. I mean, I think Kiama should definitely name the main street after Orry.
At what point did you establish the style for this film?
It took a long time to find the style for the film, and I think it should, because I think style shouldn't be imposed. I think it's got to come from what the heart of your story is. So we had to find the story. We had to work out, what are we saying about Orry? Who was he? What are we saying about, his work, his life, and his design? And so it was really a year of research before Catherine Thompson, our brilliant writer, and I sat down and went, okay, now how do we tell this stuff? And how do we give Orry, who is so witty and dry and self-deprecating, so Australian, really, how do we give him a voice?
And what's the story behind his memoir? Have you seen this unpublished memoir that is apparently in possession of one of his relatives?
There's a long story behind the memoir. I've got to say that I feel that I don't want to give away too much because we do talk about it in the film and about how he was writing it and how it was lost. And what finally happened with the memoir is something that is going to be finally revealed in the film. In the credits, by the way, so don't leave the cinema early. But yes, right from the very beginning, when we talked to the Hollywood costume historians, this whole thing came up about there's a mystery missing memoir, which of course drove Catherine and I crazy. And we got into every archive. Catherine, in the end, at her own expense, flew to LA and said, I think I'll just front up at some of the archives and do the old, I've come from Australia, please can't you let me in the back room to look for boxes?
Do you think there was something symbolic in how Catherine discovered an unmarked box, I understand, full of his memorabilia, including his 3 Oscars, which had tarnished? Can you tell us just a bit about that discovery and how that impacted?
Absolutely, because, I mean, it's half the material we now have in the film. And you know what? It would never have been found if we weren't making this film. I mean, the Warner's archives are basically a warehouse in the valley. They're not open to the public. I mean, things are just sort of shelved there. And it was really because we wouldn't give up, and also because I formed a relationship with Jack and Anne Warner's daughter, Barbara Warner Howard, and Anne Warner, Jack Warner, the head of the Warner Brothers. His wife was Orry's best friend, and she was with him when he died. And Barbara adored Orry. She was one of the few. She remembered him as a little girl, and she was so excited we're making the film. Now, Warner's family don't own the company anymore, but there's certain respect for the Warner's family from the archive. So I asked Barbara if she would write an introductory letter so Catherine Thompson could front up and and allow her to go in there and look. 3 days after we had the letter written, she said, a heads up. The head of the archives thinks he's found something. And then I had this email saying, this is from the head who'd been the head of the archive for 40 years, we may have something. We found an unmarked box. So Catherine turns up, and by then we had to also sign that she wouldn't photocopy anything from the box. We'd have to pay for a security guard to stand over her while she looked at the things in the box because they don't own the copyright and they don't know who does. And there in the box were beautiful costume sketches with pieces of fabric from all the last 5 films of his life, like Irma la Douce. So, beautiful charcoal sketches of Shirley MacLaine holding the little puppy with the green bow in her hair. There were photos that said to Orry, love Cole Porter, dearest Orry from Marion Davies. I mean, and then little photos which, when you looked at them, you thought, these look like early 1900s, and they're standing on a beach. It had to be Kiama relatives' photos, and the Oscars. What I think that box was, and also there was a picture of his dog, and one of the boyfriends along the way in his uniform. I think what the box was, I think that when Orry died, his best friend Anne went to his apartment. And she did that sad thing, unpacking, his precious things. There's, his lovely photo of Marion, who he loved, and Cole Porter, and there's the boyfriend's picture. And so she put all these personal things and these beautiful drawings and put them in the box. And then she probably took them home and they sat in her office. She dies 10 years later. Her 2 daughters come into the Warner's mansion, which is stacked with scripts and memorabilia from Jack Warner. They see this box it's got costume designs and maybe it's got an Oscar peeping out of it, and they think it's part of Jack. So off it goes to the Warner's archive, and that's where it had sat for whatever it is, 40, 50 years.
Extraordinary tale. Now, one of the other interesting things about this lovely film is that on the poster, you have proclaimed only in cinemas.
Ah.
You must be aware of that. You took part in the design of the poster, presumably?
Well, of course, I'm looking at the design. I'm looking at the names of all the wonderful
only
actresses.
In cinemas, it says, very, very robustly.
Oh, well, that's obviously from our distributor, who doesn't want anyone to know that one day it may be on Foxtel and maybe on DVD. But we all want you to see it in cinemas because It is a big screen film, and we got such beautiful clips, and we spent months and months, choosing the best of some of those incredible films. You've got to see Mame and Oklahoma and 42nd Street on the big screen.